The December wind cut through downtown Nashville with the kind of bite that made even the most seasoned locals pull their coats tighter. Clara Evans stood outside the frosted glass doors of Meridian Publishing, watching her breath form small clouds that dissipated as quickly as her hopes seemed to lately. 28 years old, with auburn hair that caught the amber glow of the holiday lights strung across the street, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that photographers loved, but that she herself had never quite learned to appreciate. The rejection email from her literary agent still glowed on her phone screen, the words blurring slightly as she read them for the fourth time in 10 minutes. Another manuscript declined. Another year of waitressing at the Bluebird Cafe, while her creative writing degree gathered dust. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days serving coffee to aspiring musicians who chased their dreams with guitars instead of keyboards, yet seemed infinitely more confident in their pursuits than she felt about hers. Clara shifted the weight of her worn leather messenger bag and glanced at her watch. She was already 15 minutes late for her shift, but somehow her feet remained anchored to the sidewalk. The familiar weight of disappointment settled in her chest, that hollow ache she'd grown accustomed to over the past year of literary rejections and dwindling savings. A gentle bump against her shoulder interrupted her reverie. She looked up to find Benjamin Scott steadying himself after apparently walking straight into her while absorbed in his own phone. 6 feet tall with dark hair, perpetually tousled from running his fingers through it when he was thinking. Benjamin had the kind of easy smile that made strangers feel like old friends. His green eyes, framed by wire-rimmed glasses that he'd worn since college, widened with recognition and immediate concern. Benjamin worked as a pediatric nurse at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital, a career choice that had surprised everyone who knew him in college, except Clara. She remembered how he used to volunteer at the campus tutoring center, patiently explaining calculus concepts to struggling freshmen with the same gentle persistence he now brought to comforting scared children and worried parents. They'd known each other since their sophomore year at Middle Tennessee State University, bonding over late-night study sessions in the library and a shared love of obscure documentaries. Their friendship had always existed in that comfortable space between platonic and something more, though neither had ever been brave enough to cross that line. After graduation, they'd maintained their connection through sporadic coffee dates and the occasional text message, but life had a way of creating distance even between people who lived in the same city. Clara told him about the rejection, her voice steady, despite the way her hands trembled slightly around her coffee cup. They'd moved inside the Bluebird, where the warmth and familiar scent of roasted beans provided a refuge from both the cold and her disappointment. Benjamin listened with the same focused attention she remembered from college, his eyes never leaving her face as she explained how this particular manuscript had felt different, more honest and vulnerable than anything she'd written before. The afternoon crowd buzzed around them, tourists hoping to catch a glimpse of the next country music sensation, and locals seeking caffeine and conversation. Clara's manager, an understanding woman named Sarah, who'd been running the cafe for over a decade, had waved her toward a corner table when she'd explained her situation. Sarah had daughters of her own and seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of when someone needed grace more than punctuality. Benjamin reached across the small table and briefly touched Clara's hand, a gesture so natural and comforting that neither of them acknowledged it directly. His fingers were warm from holding his coffee mug, and Clara noticed he still wore the simple silver watch his grandmother had given him for graduation. Some details about people never changed, even as everything else shifted around them. He told her about his recent struggles too, how the demands of his job had intensified over the past year as hospitals dealt with staffing shortages and increased patient loads. The emotional weight of caring for sick children while supporting their families had begun to follow him home, settling into his bones like a persistent ache. He'd been considering a transfer to a less intensive unit, but the thought of abandoning his current patients felt like a betrayal of the very reason he'd become a nurse in the first place. They talked for over an hour, their conversation meandering through shared memories and current uncertainties with the ease of people who'd known each other long enough to be comfortable with silence as well as words. Clara found herself remembering why she'd always felt so at peace in Benjamin's presence. He possessed a rare quality of making others feel heard without judgment, a skill that served him well in his profession and had always made their friendship feel like a safe harbor. As the conversation continued, Benjamin mentioned his family's upcoming Christmas gathering, an annual tradition that had grown increasingly complicated as his siblings paired off and started families of their own. His parents, both retired teachers with strong opinions about their children's romantic lives, had begun their yearly campaign of concerned questions and well-meaning introductions to eligible young women from their church or neighborhood. Clara laughed when he described his mother's latest attempt at matchmaking, recognizing the familiar pattern of parental anxiety disguised as helpful concern. Her own parents, while generally supportive of her writing ambitions, had begun dropping increasingly less subtle hints about grandchildren and the biological clock that apparently began ticking more loudly after 25. The idea emerged naturally from their conversation, so organically that neither could later remember exactly who had suggested it first. Clara mentioned that her own family Christmas would likely involve similar questioning about her perpetually single status, and Benjamin joked that they should attend each other's family gatherings as a buffer against unwanted romantic advice. Clara's suggestion that they pretend to be a couple for Christmas started as exactly that, a joke born from shared frustration and the comfortable intimacy of old friendship. She laughed as she said it, imagining the relief they could provide each other from well-meaning family members who seemed to view their single status as a problem requiring immediate solution. But Benjamin's response surprised them both. Instead of laughing along with her casual suggestion, he grew quiet, his green eyes taking on a thoughtful intensity that made Clara's pulse quicken in a way she hadn't experienced in months. He set down his coffee mug with careful precision and leaned forward slightly, closing the space between them across the small table. Benjamin's voice was steady when he finally spoke, but Clara caught the slight tremor underneath that suggested whatever he was about to say had been weighing on his mind for longer than this single conversation. He told her that pretending seemed like a waste of something that could be real, that he'd been thinking about the space between them for years without knowing how to bridge it. The words hung in the air between them, like a question that required no verbal answer. Clara felt her heart rate accelerate as she processed not just what Benjamin had said, but the way he was looking at her, as if he was seeing something he'd been searching for without realizing it. The familiar noise of the cafe seemed to fade into background murmur as her attention narrowed to focus entirely on the man sitting across from her. She realized, with the kind of sudden clarity that feels both shocking and inevitable, that her feelings for Benjamin had never been as purely platonic as she'd convinced herself they were. The comfort she felt in his presence, the way her day brightened whenever his name appeared on her phone screen, the subtle jealousy she'd experienced whenever he mentioned dating other women, all took on new meaning in the context of his quiet confession. Benjamin reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, his movements careful and deliberate. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she recognized what she was seeing, though her mind struggled to process the reality of the moment. The box itself was simple. Forest green velvet worn soft around the edges, clearly vintage and carrying the weight of family history. He explained, his voice barely above a whisper in the busy cafe, that the ring had belonged to his grandmother, a woman Clara remembered him describing with deep affection during their college years. His grandmother had been a writer too, he reminded her, someone who'd spent her life crafting stories for children's magazines, while raising 4 children during an era when such ambitions were considered unusual for women. Benjamin told Clara that his grandmother had always believed that love should be both comfortable and exciting, a combination of deep friendship and romantic passion that too many people settled for having separately. He'd been carrying the ring for weeks, he admitted, trying to find the courage to tell Clara how he felt, but unsure whether their friendship could survive the risk of something more. Clara stared at the ring nestled in its velvet box, a simple platinum band with a modest diamond that caught the cafe's warm lighting and threw tiny rainbows across the table surface. The ring was beautiful in its understated elegance, clearly chosen by someone who valued substance over ostentation. But more than its beauty, she was moved by what it represented. Benjamin's quiet certainty about something she hadn't even allowed herself to fully consider. Her hands trembled as she reached across the table, not to take the ring, but to cover Benjamin's hands with her own. The gesture felt both monumental and completely natural, a physical manifestation of the emotional territory they were suddenly navigating together. She could feel the warmth of his skin and the slight calluses on his fingertips from years of medical work, details that grounded her in the reality of the moment. Clara found herself remembering fragments of their shared history with new understanding. The way Benjamin had always seemed to appear during her most difficult moments, offering support without being asked. How he'd spent an entire weekend helping her move into her current apartment, assembling furniture and painting walls without complaint. The thoughtful gifts he'd given her over the years, books by authors he'd discovered and thought she'd enjoy, or small items that showed he'd been paying attention to things she'd mentioned in passing. She thought about the way conversation had always flowed so easily between them, how they could discuss everything from trivial daily annoyances to their deepest fears without the performance anxiety that seemed to plague her other relationships. Benjamin had seen her at her worst, during finals week breakdown and family drama and creative disappointments, and had never made her feel judged or diminished by her vulnerabilities. The realization that she was in love with him hit her with surprising force, not because it was unexpected, but because it felt so obvious in retrospect. The feeling had been growing quietly in the background of their friendship for years, camouflaged by familiarity and her own assumptions about their relationship's boundaries. Now, faced with Benjamin's gentle proposal and his grandmother's ring, she could no longer pretend that her feelings were anything less than profound. Clara's response came as a whisper, barely audible even to Benjamin sitting inches away. She told him yes, but the words seemed insufficient to contain everything she was feeling. Yes to the ring, yes to the relationship, yes to the courage required to transform their friendship into something deeper and more complex. Yes to the risk of losing what they had in pursuit of what they might become together. Benjamin's smile, when she accepted, was unlike anything she'd seen from him before, combining relief and joy with something that looked very much like wonder. He slipped the ring onto her finger, with hands that shook slightly, both of them watching as the platinum band settled into place, as if it had always belonged there. The fit was perfect, another detail that felt like confirmation of something larger than coincidence. The rest of their time at the cafe passed in a blur of quiet conversation and nervous laughter, both of them adjusting to the new reality of their relationship while surrounded by the ordinary bustle of afternoon customers. They talked about practical things, when to tell their families, and how to navigate the transition from friendship to romance. But underneath the practical discussions was a current of excitement and anticipation that neither tried to hide. Benjamin walked Clara home as the sun began to set, painting the Nashville skyline in shades of amber and rose. The December air no longer felt quite as cold, though whether that was due to the weather or her elevated emotional state, Clara couldn't be certain. They moved slowly along the familiar route to her apartment, neither wanting to end what felt like the most significant day of their lives. Her neighborhood, a collection of modest houses and converted apartments popular with young professionals and graduate students, looked different somehow in the golden light of late afternoon. Christmas decorations that had seemed cheerfully generic that morning now appeared magical, as if the entire world had been transformed by the simple act of acknowledging feelings that had been present all along. Clara's apartment occupied the second floor of a house built in the 1920s, with hardwood floors that creaked in predictable places and windows that required careful manipulation to open properly. She'd always loved the character of the old building, the way afternoon light streamed through the vintage glass and created patterns on her walls, but she saw it now through Benjamin's eyes as he climbed the stairs behind her. They stood in her living room, surrounded by the evidence of her life as a struggling writer. Stacks of books covered every available surface. Manuscripts in various stages of completion competed for space with literary magazines and craft guides. Her laptop sat open on a small table near the window. A half-finished short story, abandoned mid-sentence when she'd left for the disastrous meeting with the editor that morning. Benjamin picked up one of her published stories from a literary magazine, studying the byline with obvious pride. Clara watched him read, noting how his expression softened as he encountered passages she'd forgotten she'd written. Having him in her space, seeing her work through his eyes, felt more intimate than any physical gesture they'd shared. The engagement ring caught the light from her reading lamp, sending small sparkles across the wall behind her desk. Clara found herself looking at it frequently, still struggling to believe that the morning's disappointment had transformed into the most surprising and joyful evening she could remember. The weight of the ring on her finger felt both foreign and completely right, like coming home to a place she'd never known she was looking for. They ordered dinner from the Thai restaurant down the street, spreading the containers across her small kitchen table and eating with the kind of easy intimacy that comes from years of shared meals. But everything was different now, charged with possibility and the delicious uncertainty of new romance layered over deep friendship. Clara caught Benjamin looking at her with an expression she'd never seen before, tender and possessive in a way that made her pulse quicken. As the evening progressed, they talked about their fears as well as their hopes. Clara admitted that she was terrified of ruining the best friendship she'd ever had, while Benjamin confessed that he'd been in love with her for longer than he'd been willing to acknowledge even to himself. They discussed the logistics of merging their lives, the practical considerations of two people who'd built separate existences, deciding to create something together. Benjamin mentioned that his lease was up for renewal in February, a detail that suddenly took on new significance in the context of their changed relationship. Clara's heart rate accelerated as she realized he might be suggesting moving in together, a step that felt both too fast and completely natural given the foundation of their long friendship. They moved to her living room as full darkness settled outside, Clara curling against Benjamin's side on her second-hand sofa with a naturalness that surprised them both. The physical closeness they'd always maintained as friends expanded to include new possibilities, though both were careful not to push too quickly into unfamiliar territory. The evening felt precious and fragile, requiring gentle handling to avoid breaking the magic of their transformation. Clara rested her head against Benjamin's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne, mixed with the lingering traces of hospital antiseptic that always clung to his clothes. She'd never noticed before how comforting that particular combination smelled, how it represented his dedication to caring for others and his willingness to carry that responsibility even when he was off duty. Benjamin's arm around her felt like the most natural thing in the world, though the gesture carried weight it had never possessed during their casual, friendly embraces. Clara could feel his heartbeat through his sweater. slightly elevated in a way that matched her own nervous excitement. They were both navigating uncharted territory, trying to honor their friendship while exploring the romantic possibilities they'd discovered. They talked quietly about Christmas plans that would now include both families, about the logistics of presenting their relationship as new while acknowledging that their connection had deep roots. Clara's parents, Benjamin realized, had always liked him during their brief previous meetings, often asking Clara why she and that nice young man from college never seemed to date. The question had always made Clara uncomfortable in ways she hadn't fully understood until now. Benjamin's family would be similarly unsurprised, he suspected. His mother had mentioned Clara frequently over the years, usually in the context of wondering why Benjamin never seemed to bring girlfriends around who were as intelligent and grounded as his friend from college. The comparison had always embarrassed him, though he'd never been able to explain exactly why, without acknowledging feelings he wasn't ready to examine. As the evening deepened, Clara found herself studying Benjamin's face with new attention, noting details she'd somehow missed despite years of friendship. The way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled, the small scar near his left temple from a childhood accident he'd once described during a late-night conversation, the careful way he listened, giving her his complete attention even when she was describing mundane details of her day. The familiar routine of ending an evening together felt different now, charged with possibility and uncertainty about what came next. They'd spent countless evenings like this over the years, Clara walking Benjamin to the door and hugging goodbye before he drove home to his apartment across town. But tonight, the prospect of separation felt more difficult, as if they were interrupting something important rather than simply ending a social visit. Benjamin lingered at her door, both of them reluctant to break the spell of their first day as more than friends. The hallway light cast long shadows down the stairs, and Clara could hear her neighbor's television murmuring through the thin walls. Everything about the moment felt ordinary, except for the extraordinary shift that had occurred in their relationship. When Benjamin finally kissed her goodnight, it was with the kind of gentle certainty that left Clara feeling both satisfied and eager for more. The kiss was soft and brief, a promise rather than a conclusion, acknowledgement of territory they would explore together at their own pace. Clara watched from her window as he walked to his car, the engagement ring catching the streetlight as she waved goodbye. Alone in her apartment, Clara sat at her desk and opened a new document on her laptop. The rejection from that morning felt like something that had happened weeks ago rather than hours, rendered insignificant by the day's unexpected developments. She began to write, not the polished prose she struggled to craft for submission to literary magazines, but the raw, honest voice that flowed when she wrote purely for herself. She wrote about friendship transforming into love, about the courage required to risk security for the possibility of something deeper. The words came easily, flowing with the kind of natural rhythm she'd been chasing in her fiction for months. Clara realized she was writing their story, not as it had happened, but as it felt, capturing the emotional truth of the day, even if the specific details would remain private between them. Benjamin called as she was getting ready for bed, his voice warm and slightly uncertain over the phone. They talked for only a few minutes, both still adjusting to the new dynamic of their relationship and unsure about appropriate boundaries. But hearing his voice before sleep felt right, a natural extension of the intimacy they'd discovered that day. Clara lay in bed wearing his grandmother's engagement ring, watching the shadows of bare tree branches move across her ceiling as cars passed on the street below. The ring felt substantial on her finger, a physical reminder of promises made and futures imagined. She thought about Benjamin's grandmother, the writer who'd believed love should be both comfortable and exciting, and wondered if the old woman would have approved of their unconventional beginning. Sleep came easily, despite her emotional excitement. her dreams filled with images of Christmas celebrations and shared futures she'd never allowed herself to envision before. When she woke the next morning, the ring was still there on her finger, proof that the previous day's transformation had been real rather than wishful thinking. The next few weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery as Clara and Benjamin navigated the early stages of their romantic relationship. They moved slowly and carefully, both aware of the precious friendship they were building upon and determined not to damage it in their eagerness to explore new possibilities. Their first official date was deliberately simple: dinner at a quiet restaurant where they could talk without distraction. But even that familiar activity felt different now, charged with the awareness that they were actively choosing each other rather than simply enjoying compatible company. Clara found herself noticing the way Benjamin's eyes lit up when he laughed, details that had always been present but now carried romantic significance. Benjamin proved to be as thoughtful a boyfriend as he'd been a friend, remembering small details about Clara's preferences and surprising her with gestures that showed he'd been paying attention to things she'd mentioned in passing. When she received another rejection letter, this time from a publisher she'd particularly hoped would be interested in her work, Benjamin appeared at her apartment with her favorite Thai food and a willingness to listen without trying to fix her disappointment. Clara's writing began to change as her emotional landscape shifted. The stories she'd struggled to complete for months started flowing again, infused with new understanding about love and risk and the courage required to be vulnerable with another person. She found herself writing with more honesty, less concerned with impressing editors and more focused on capturing authentic human experiences. Their families reacted to the news of their engagement with the kind of pleased surprise that suggested everyone had been waiting for them to figure out what seemed obvious to outside observers. Clara's mother admitted she'd always hoped Clara would end up with Benjamin, while his parents expressed delight that their son had finally found someone who appreciated his thoughtful nature. The Christmas gathering they'd originally planned to attend as pretend couple became their first public appearance as an engaged couple. Clara wore a simple red dress that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, while Benjamin chose a sweater his grandmother had knitted him years earlier, a detail Clara found touching in its sentimentality. Benjamin's family home in the suburbs of Nashville was everything Clara had expected based on his descriptions: warm and welcoming, decorated with a mixture of family photographs and handmade ornaments accumulated over decades of holidays. His parents, both in their early 60s with the kind of comfortable partnership that comes from years of shared experiences, embraced Clara as if she'd always been part of their family. The evening progressed with the easy rhythm of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Benjamin's siblings, a mix of married couples and young professionals at various stages of their own romantic journeys, treated Clara with the affectionate teasing typically reserved for long-time family members. She realized they'd been hearing about her for years through Benjamin's casual mentions, making their acceptance feel both immediate and long overdue. Clara found herself in the kitchen with Benjamin's mother, helping prepare coffee and dessert while the men gathered around the television to debate college football scores. The domestic scene felt natural and comfortable, as if she'd been participating in their family traditions for years, rather than experiencing them for the first time. Benjamin's mother, a former high school English teacher with keen observational skills, asked Clara about her writing, with the kind of informed interest that suggested Benjamin had shared detailed information about her work and ambitions. Clara found herself discussing her creative process with more openness than she typically managed, encouraged by genuine curiosity rather than polite conversation. The older woman mentioned that Benjamin had been talking about Clara for years, describing her talents and accomplishments with obvious pride long before their relationship had become romantic. Clara felt touched to learn that Benjamin had been championing her work to his family, building appreciation for her writing, even when she struggled to believe in it herself. As the evening wound down, Clara and Benjamin sat together on the family room sofa, watching his youngest nephew play with new toys under the Christmas tree. The domestic scene felt like a glimpse into potential futures they might build together, though neither voiced that observation directly. Instead, they simply enjoyed the moment, surrounded by people who loved them and accepted their relationship with unreserved happiness. The drive home through Nashville's quiet streets gave them time to process the evening and discuss their observations about family dynamics they'd witnessed. Clara had been struck by the obvious affection between Benjamin's parents, the way they still seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company after 30-plus years of marriage. Benjamin noted how naturally Clara had fit into his family's rhythms, contributing to conversations and helping with tasks without being asked. Back at Clara's apartment, they sat together reviewing the day's events while sharing leftover Christmas cookies Benjamin's mother had insisted they take home. The simple act of sharing food and conversation in her living room felt simultaneously familiar and new. Their friendship expanded to include romantic possibilities they were still learning to navigate. Clara had been wearing the engagement ring for several weeks now, long enough for its weight to feel natural on her finger. But she still caught herself looking at it throughout the day with something approaching wonder. The ring represented not just Benjamin's proposal, but her own courage in accepting the risk of transforming their friendship into something deeper and more complex. They'd begun talking about wedding plans in tentative terms, discussing preferences for small ceremonies and intimate gatherings rather than elaborate celebrations. Both felt that their relationship was already built on such strong foundations that the wedding itself should be a celebration of commitments already made, rather than the beginning of getting to know each other. Benjamin had suggested a spring wedding, reasoning that the timing would allow them to enjoy their engagement period without rushing into planning mode immediately after Christmas. Clara appreciated his thoughtfulness about pacing, his recognition that they were making a significant transition that deserved careful attention rather than hurried execution. New Year's Eve found them at a small party hosted by mutual friends from college, people who'd known them both throughout their friendship and were delighted to learn about their engagement. Clara enjoyed seeing their relationship through the eyes of people who'd witnessed its evolution over time, friends who expressed pleasure but not surprise at the romantic turn their partnership had taken. The countdown to midnight gave Clara an opportunity to reflect on the year that was ending, how different her life looked now compared to 12 months earlier. The morning of Benjamin's proposal, she'd been struggling with professional disappointments and personal loneliness that had felt insurmountable. Now, surrounded by friends and wearing an engagement ring that caught the party's dim lighting, her entire life felt transformed. When Benjamin kissed her at midnight, surrounded by celebrating friends and the promise of a new year ahead, Clara felt the kind of deep happiness she'd read about in novels, but never quite believed was available in real life. The kiss was soft and brief, appropriate for public display, but it carried the weight of all their shared history and the excitement of futures they were planning together. January brought new routines as Clara and Benjamin began the practical work of merging their lives. Benjamin's lease renewal deadline forced decisions about living arrangements that might have felt rushed in a newer relationship, but seemed natural given their years of friendship. They decided he should move into Clara's apartment, at least temporarily, while they looked for a larger place that would feel like home to both of them. The process of combining their possessions proved surprisingly smooth, their tastes compatible in ways that reflected similar values and life experiences. Benjamin's books blended seamlessly with Clara's extensive collection, while his practical household items filled gaps in her somewhat haphazard domestic setup. They discovered shared preferences for simple furniture and warm lighting, creating spaces that felt welcoming rather than showy. Clara's writing desk, positioned near the large window in their living room, became a focal point that Benjamin treated with appropriate respect. He understood that her creative work required both physical and emotional space, making sure she maintained the routines and environment that supported her productivity. His support felt different from the encouragement she'd received from friends over the years, more invested and comprehensive. Benjamin's work schedule at the hospital required adjustments on both their parts, his 12-hour shifts creating periods of separation balanced by extended time off when they could focus completely on each other. Clara learned to appreciate the intensity of his commitment to his patients while also supporting his need for decompression and emotional processing after particularly difficult days. Their domestic life developed natural rhythms that honored both their professional commitments and their relationship priorities. They cooked dinner together when Benjamin's schedule allowed, shopped for groceries with the shared pleasure of people planning meals for two, and created comfortable evening routines that provided stability in their individually demanding careers. Clara's writing began to reflect her expanding emotional vocabulary as she explored the complexity of love that grew from friendship rather than passion. Her stories took on new depth and authenticity, drawing from her own experience of gradual realization rather than dramatic romantic revelation. Editors began responding to her submissions with more interest, noting the increased emotional sophistication in her recent work. One evening in late January, as Nashville experienced an unusual snowfall that transformed the city into a winter wonderland, Clara and Benjamin walked through their neighborhood, discussing plans for their spring wedding. The snow muffled the usual urban sounds, creating an intimate atmosphere that felt appropriate for sharing hopes and concerns about their upcoming marriage. They'd decided on a small ceremony in the garden behind Benjamin's parents' house, surrounded by immediate family and closest friends, in a setting that reflected their preference for meaningful gatherings over elaborate celebrations. Clara's parents had offered to help with arrangements, their enthusiasm for the match evident in their eagerness to contribute to the planning process. The guest list remained deliberately short, limited to people who'd played significant roles in their individual lives or their friendship over the years. They wanted their wedding to feel like an authentic celebration rather than an obligation to distant relatives or professional acquaintances, a gathering of people who understood the foundation their marriage was built upon. Clara had found her wedding dress at a small boutique downtown, a simple design in ivory silk that complemented her understated style without overwhelming her petite frame. The dress felt appropriate for the informal garden ceremony they were planning, elegant without being ostentatious, classic without being outdated. Benjamin had chosen to wear his father's wedding suit, altered to fit his taller frame, but carrying the sentimental value of family tradition. Clara loved the gesture's combination of practicality and sentiment, typical of Benjamin's approach to important decisions throughout their relationship. Their wedding planning conversations often turned into broader discussions about the marriage itself, their hopes and expectations for building a life together based on mutual respect and shared values. They talked about career goals and family plans, financial responsibilities and domestic arrangements, approaching these topics with the same thorough consideration they'd always brought to important decisions. February brought Clara's first significant publication in a national literary magazine, a short story that had been inspired by her evolving understanding of love and commitment. The acceptance letter arrived on a Thursday morning when Benjamin was at work, and Clara found herself saving the celebration until he could share it with her, a realization that her joys had become inherently connected to his presence. Benjamin's reaction to her news demonstrated the kind of generous pride that had characterized his friendship with her from the beginning. He insisted on taking her to dinner at the restaurant where they'd shared their first official date, treating her professional success with the same importance he'd given his own career milestones over the years. The publication brought inquiries from other editors and a request from a small press to review a collection of Clara's stories for possible publication. For the first time since college, Clara felt genuine momentum in her writing career, as if the emotional growth she'd experienced through her relationship with Benjamin had unlocked creative possibilities that had been waiting for the right catalyst. March arrived with the early signs of spring that made Nashville's residents remember why they loved living in a city where seasons created dramatic transformations in both landscape and mood. Clara and Benjamin spent their free time shopping for wedding flowers and finalizing details for their ceremony. Tasks that felt meaningful rather than stressful because they reflected genuine preferences rather than external expectations. Their wedding invitations, simple cards printed on recycled paper with elegant typography, were addressed by hand in Clara's careful cursive. The task took several evenings, but they approached it as quality time together rather than a chore, talking while Clara wrote and Benjamin organized their guest information into neat stacks. The responses came back quickly, almost universally positive from people who'd been hoping for this development in their relationship for years. Clara's college roommate wrote a note expressing delight that Clara had finally figured out what everyone else had seen clearly, while Benjamin's best friend from medical school included a check and a promise to embarrass Benjamin appropriately during his best man speech. Their final dress rehearsal took place on a warm April evening in Benjamin's parents' backyard, the garden coming alive with early spring blooms that would provide natural decoration for their ceremony. Clara felt a deep sense of rightness as she walked through the space where they would exchange vows, surrounded by people who'd supported both their friendship and their romance. The rehearsal dinner was held at the same restaurant where Benjamin had proposed, a choice that felt symbolic of their journey from friendship to engagement to marriage. Clara wore the first dress Benjamin had ever complimented her on, a detail he remembered and mentioned when he saw her that evening, typical of his attention to meaningful moments in their shared history. As Clara fell asleep the night before their wedding, wearing the engagement ring that had started their romantic journey 4 months earlier, she felt the kind of peaceful anticipation that comes from making decisions that align completely with personal values and desires. Tomorrow would mark the official beginning of their marriage, but the commitment it represented felt like the natural evolution of everything they'd built together over years of friendship and months of careful romantic exploration.